I'm Melissa Lindstrom. I'm one of the owners of 585 State Road in Plymouth. And I'm here to talk about the history of this house, which is extremely unique and fascinating.
We know where this house is. You've probably driven by it. It's right beside the Stars I Am restaurant in Manomet. Right, heading south, right after Manomet Four Corners. When was the house built?
My parents had it traced back to about 1660.
Okay. And when does the history of the house begin?
Well, it begins in Holland with Richard Warren, who was one of the original pilgrims who came over on the Mayflower and then sent for the rest of his family, one of whom was his older daughter, Mary, who married a gentleman named Bartlett. And from thence, this house came because two of their sons apparently got together and built this house in about 1660.
Was there anything unusual about this house?
Well, yeah, there was. It was basically kind of a duplex, for one thing. And it only has a cellar under one side of the duplex, which was the summer kitchen for both families. But another thing that's notable about the house is that it has quite high ceilings for the time. In a time where they had the lowest ceilings possible and people weren't terribly tall, they wanted to keep the heat in the winter, and anyone that had a high ceiling was felt to be a little wealthier than the average person. So those things are kind of unique about this house.
Who lived there after the brothers?
The house kept passing down to Bartlett's for many years until in the 1800s it was no longer used as a home but became the Manomet post office. And I understand that somewhere in the front wall of the house is still a letter slot that they came up by the door to put letters in to be mailed.
And what happened next?
Well, after the post office ceased to be, the land went into, I believe, private hands, but it may still have been Bartlett. Some of the land that that belongs to the house is still was still owned by Bartlett's, and at some point it was turned into a makeshift barn. It was painted battleship gray, walls, ceilings, and floors, and goats and chickens were housed there for quite some years.
What years was that?
That would have been probably in the early 40s.
Okay. And I understand some of the Bartletts are buried up at...
Oh, many of the Bartletts are buried up at the Four Corners at the church. It's, and matter of fact, the last gentleman that I believe lived there is right in the front row to the left of the front door to the church as you face it.
Very interesting. What was, when did your parents buy the home?
They bought the home mid to late 40s. They didn't live there right away because we lived in Hyannis at the time I was born, which was late 40s, and they were redoing the inside. They were stripping all the battleship gray paint from the beautiful pine paneling in one of the front rooms. They were just trying to make it livable, and at some point they also wanted to put a little back hall on so you didn't open the huge door and immediately step into the wilds from the kitchen.
Okay. What was their contribution to the history of the house?
They saved so many of the wonderful features. The front door is an original door.
That is awesome, and I noticed it's got the slab.
Yes, it's got an old mill wheel as the doorstep, and as you go into the hall, there's a stairway down to the summer kitchen, and it's the original stairway, almost more like a ladder. It's much safer to go down it backward like a ladder than to try to go down it forward because it's so steep. And that leads you to beautiful fireplaces and bread ovens that were where they cooked their food in the summer to keep cool and keep the heat out of the main house. There are also beautiful back-to-back corner fireplaces in the upper story that are part of the history of the house. And it has, in the old part of the house, all the gorgeous, wide floorboards that my parents had refinished.
It is beautiful. It is absolutely beautiful. And I wonder, did anyone really historic walk through that front door?
Probably, but I don't really know who. It was so old. And at the time the people built the house, the nearest civilization was in Plymouth. And it was like a 2-day trip to climb the Pine Hills and get there on foot or with a mule or with a horse. It was very long trip, very taxing.
Right. I understand that the Moose Lodge was actually an inn at that time.
Absolutely. And there's at the bridge, there is a horse trough built into the stone bridge.
That would be interesting. I'm gonna have to check that out.
Yeah, it's on the west side.
Is it on is the home on the historic register?
No, it isn't. I know that my parents looked into it at one point or another and decided for whatever reason they weren't going to do it at that time. But it should be.
It should be. It definitely should be. What history remains in the home?
Well, all the things that I've mentioned, the original pine paneling, the floorboards, every timber, even the timbers that the uncellared part of the house are on have been restored. It's just, everything is there. The birthing room is still there, even though the other half of the house burned down. My parents made a second half of the house to match the original house. Now, some of the paneling, the beautiful paneling that's in the house now, there was paneling like that in the other half of the house, and some of that paneling is in the cottages down on White Horse Beach because people salvaged some of the stuff from the burned part of the house.
It definitely wasn't a throwaway society.
No, they recycled and used everything.
What was the village like then?
Well, as I said, it was very religious. The little church up at the Four Corners was moved and rebuilt 4 or 5 times, and it finally took its current place. And it was so far away from everything that they were very close. There were just a few families. There were the Churchills, the Bartletts, the Ellises, and you see all of those names in abundance in the graveyard at the little church. I'm sure there's another place where people were probably buried because there were a couple other locations where they had the church, but it is the oldest church in the county, in the state.
Okay. I remember reading about Mary Warren when we were in grade school. What was Manomet like when you lived there?
It was a nice little town. We had the state road. We didn't have the bypass then, Route 3. We just had 3A. That was the only route to the Cape. We had the little liquor store across the street where we could go and get packages of peanuts. We had Bartlett's across the street. Their mother still lives there. A couple of boys who are a little older than I was, and they would get out on that road, which was considered quite dangerous, with their bicycles and ride back and forth across the street when I got off the bus so I could cross the street safely when I was a little girl.
And of course you always had the beach.
We always had the beach. There was a fabulous donut shop on the way to the beach, and my father and I would walk down and get donuts on a Sunday morning and bring them back to the house. We had the little Manomet Elementary School that I went for the first 3 years of my school career, and that's still there. They've built onto it, but basically the same little school is there, which is kind of nice. And a little village up on the other side of the river, built up a little bit with the post office and various stores. But it was a fun place. We used to sit out on a Sunday afternoon and watch all the cars boil over going up 3A, because the traffic coming off the Cape in the summer was so horrendous that the cars all overheated trying to get up the hill.
Wow.
It was really, I mean, that was our amusement. We had a very simple life.
What do you think of the advantage of living in this location now?
It's so rural, and yet it really is convenient to the highway. It's convenient to all of the stores and everything in Plymouth, library. There are also restaurants and stores down the other way toward the Cape. It is a way to sneak down almost onto the Cape in the summer.
It almost has the Cape feel. Once you come over the Pine Hills, you almost feel like you're on the Cape.
Yes, you do. You do. It's a wonderful, it's just wonderful. So we went down to the Cape all the time. We had various places to go. There was a chowder place that my father liked, and a fried clam place that he liked, and various restaurants. And
what would you like to see for the house in the future?
I would like to see somebody with the time and the patience and the love of history to get it up and running again. Unbeknownst to us, some of it has been pretty well robbed of its beauty, but everything that's wrong with the house is only cosmetic. And if I were even 10 years younger, I think I'd tackle it myself. But at this point, I know that I can't do it in at least timely enough a fashion for